introduce myself. I'm Orville Daniels. And in keeping with how we are functioning as a bunch of retirees, you're supposed to say, what were you doing when you retired? Well, what I was doing was being Forest Supervisor on the Lolo National Forest that surrounds this place. And it was a wonderful career, just like all of you had. It was a great place. Some of you are visiting places on the Lolo on your excursions, and I think you're enjoying it. Well, thank you. We're going to have a glorious evening tonight. We're going to be doing something that I've never done before, and I suspect you've never done before. How many of you have ever attended a retirement party for a chief? Few hands, good. I never have, but tonight you all are going to do that. If you look on your program, we're going to be celebrating all of the living chiefs, and we're going to be having a retirement party for the latest retiree from the chiefdom. So it should be a glorious time. You know, I'll invite them up in just a few minutes and they'll sit in these chairs. It says on your program we're going to celebrate the chiefs. How do you do that? How do you celebrate the chiefs? And I thought long and hard on that, and the committee set this thing up. One of the ways, I think, is to recognize that the position of Chief of the Forest Service is pretty unique in the world. It's not your normal leadership position. Gifford Pinchot told us that. He made it different, and it has always been different. How many of you remember who was chief when you first went to work? Hold your hands up. Look at that. How many organizations could say such a thing? Ed Cliff was my first. I remember him well. I was a shaved tail ranger out of southern Utah, the Dixie National Forest. Went to a meeting of the Society of American Foresters. Went up and introduced myself to him. He grabbed me by the hand, took me over, and took 2 hours to tell me how he was handling the overgrazing issue in the Forest Service. Who does that with a young new forester? We have a unique situation in our agency. I studied leadership and taught leadership, but it's unique. So we're very, very fortunate to have the chiefs that we have. And maybe that's the way we honor them, is to listen to them tonight as they talk about the things that went on during their tenure and what life was like, and also honor Randy. So this is going to be fun. I feel honored to be here to do this tonight. And so right at this point, I'm going to invite the chiefs up and have them sit in the chairs. They know which ones they should sit in. And by the way, you know, you can herd cats with a hose, and you can try to get the chiefs to do what you want them to do. They're kind of independent, but they're fun to work with. And while they're doing that, since I have the mic, I was asked to announce that the Old Smokies will be outside at 7 o'clock to take photos. So I'm doing that as a maintenance kind of issue. We are going to
make one other announcement. The Intermountain Region folks are going to take their picture Thursday, 5:45 out here in the lobby. Please be present.
Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody get that? We're going to do this in a little different way. We have to. We're going to start with F. Dale Robertson. He could not be here tonight, so he's going to be with us electronically, and he's going to start off, and he'll be talking about his tenure, and then we have one other chief that he's going to talk about as well, and that's Max Peterson, who is now deceased. We are starting with Max because he was the chief when Randy started working for the Forest Service. I don't know what that was about, but anyway, that's the way we'll start. Are we ready to put that on now? They're working hard on it right over there now. By the way, there was a committee that put this thing together and asked me to be the emcee. And I decided that I sure did want to do that because to be in such a program with this many chiefs is really fun. How about the sound?
Well, good evening. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. And unfortunately, I can't be there tonight because I don't get around very well anymore and do very little traveling. But I was the 12th chief of the Forest Service from 1987 to 1993 under the administration of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And before I get started, I'm going to say a few words about my predecessor, Max Peterson. Unfortunately, Max died last year and is no longer with us, but he left a big imprint on the Forest Service. Probably one of these most important decisions was to recruit a bright young fellow named Randy Moore, who was assigned to the Pike San Isabel National Forest as a soil scientist. I too recognized Randy's potential, and during my time, we selected him as for a congressional fellow to work in Congress for a year with Senator Bennett Johnson from Louisiana, a strong supporter of the Forest Service. So we exposed Randy to the craziness of DC politics early on in his career. And I hope, Randy, that did you well throughout the rest of your career. Well, Max and I were the last big timber chiefs. Sorry about that, Chief Schultz, but in the 1980s, early 1980s, it was crazy times. We had sold a lot of high-priced timber sales in the late 70s. And then, if you remember, we had a recession in the early 80s, and the bottom dropped out of the price of lumber and plywood. So we had a lot of timber sales that were unprofitable, and if they were executed, that many timber purchasers were going to go bankrupt. We didn't have any authorization to forgive them of any contracts, so we had to go to Congress to get special legislation, which we did. And the ironic thing was, in the early 70s, we were taking back timber sale contracts at the same time the Reagan administration was pushing us to greatly increase our timber sale program to 17 to 18 million board feet, about a 50% increase. So as you might suspect, that generated a lot of discussion and negotiations. But Max and I, we did max out at over 12 billion board feet of timber, and that was about equal to about 30% of the total consumption of softwood lumber and plywood in the United States. And we did that with a lot of clear cutting. Some of you old timers probably remember the phrase, get the cutout. The Forest Service was a hard-charging, production-oriented outfit that took a lot of pride in meeting our output targets. Well, during my time as chief, things began to unravel. Probably the most important decision was the spotted owl was listed as an endangered species, and its critical habitat was the old growth forest of the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, and that's where we had about 100% of our timber sale programs. We also have endangered species problems elsewhere throughout the national forest. And then we had hundreds of appeals and lawsuits. We kept getting judicial decisions that interpreted NEPA to require ever more analysis and documentation to make timber sales. It seems like I spent more time with lawyers than I did with foresters. So by the end of my tenure, 7 years later, we were down to about 5 billion board feet, and we're pretty much out of clear cutting business. With that big of an adjustment in our biggest program and budget and staffing, it set into motion some rapid and major changes in the Forest Service. We had to take a hard look at how we manage the national forest, especially the critical habitat of endangered species, and also look at alternatives to clear cutting, because much of the public didn't see clear cutting squaring with our mission of caring for the land. So we came up with something called New Perspectives. This was where we encouraged our people to team up with our research people and to start experimenting and pilot testing different ways to manage the forest in a more environmentally sensitive ways. And that was very successful. We soon had New Perspectives projects that represented our best thinking as well as the best science. So to make a long story short, New Perspectives eventually evolved into an ecological approach to the multiple use management of the forest. And that began at the tail end of my time as chief, but it fell primarily on Jack Ward Thomas, my successor, to implement the concept. The other big change that we did was the shifting of priorities and programs. As we downsized the timber sale program, we worked very hard to increase funding for outdoor recreation and fisheries and wildlife. We came up with two big concepts. One was partnerships. I think the Forest Service can properly take credit for introducing the concept of partnership to the federal government. Prior to that, everybody was cooperators, not partners. So that has been very successful, and I've been very surprised at how it has evolved over the years. The other thing was we asked Congress to provide us with challenge cost share money. We told Congress we had a lot of partners with money that would help us do conservation projects on the national forest, but we needed some matching funds to make it happen. And so we were successful in getting that approved. So the problem was we couldn't increase these other programs' budgets as fast as we were reducing the budget and staffing for timber sales. So we ended up with a smaller Forest Service. It started a downsizing effort that lasted far beyond me. Chiefs that follow me can tell you about that, but we ended up with a smaller Forest Service, a lot of consolidation of units to reduce overhead costs. So as you can see, during particularly the last part of my tenure, it was a period of rapid change. And in the end, I could not solve the spotted owl problem. It became an issue in the 1992 presidential campaign between Bush and Clinton. We disagreed, and I worked for the fellow that lost the election. So there were many people who were angry at the Forest Service as we were making these rapid adjustments in our timber sale programs, especially rural communities whose economies were being devastated by our actions. I understood their anger, their disappointment and frustration and how they were being treated. We inflicted a lot of pain on rural America, and it created some scars that took time to heal up. So I was replaced by Jack Ward Thomas. Ironically, I selected Jack to head up a committee of scientists to help me solve the spotted owl. but in the end, it ended up in his lap. So that's my story. I retired, moved to Arizona, now live in Colorado, and had a wonderful retirement, which I hope all of you have too. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chief Robertson. And can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Chief Robertson. Now, am I doing okay? Well, I'm going to keep this on a little bit more of a personal note because I've got to thank Chief Robertson for my ending up in a hot seat. And the way that worked was he mentioned how fickle Washington could be. So at his request, he said, you know, you've done so well on partnerships for the Forest Service. There's been a change in administration. Would you consider going to BLM? And I, well, why? What have I done? He said, well, he said, they need you more than we do. And actually, it was an amazing turning point in my career because mentors at that time to me were people like Jeff Sermon and Butch Morita, who's here, who is sort of a neighbor of mine, and I thank Butch for all that he's done for me over the years. But getting back to BLM, and I said to the chief, I said, well, you know, why should I go to BLM? Jeff said, well, he said, you know, the BLM's a lot more flexible than the Forest Service, and you'll know in a year or two if you can make a difference. So the chief gave me a round-trip ticket. And after I got back, he said, but I didn't say you could come back as chief. And the fickleness of Washington was I ultimately ended up as acting director at BLM, a fisheries biologist. The head of the Fish and Wildlife Service was a forester, Molly Beatty, and Jack Ward Thomas, a wildlife biologist, was the chief of the Forest Service. And I've just got to say a few things about Jack, who I spent a lot of time with as acting director of BLM while Jack was chief. And, you know, Jack was just, he was a world-class scientist and just a brilliant mind and a keen wit. And I love to do hearings with Jack. And one of the hearings we were at was Senator Frank Murkowski, who could berate agencies pretty good when he got on a rant. Jack and I and Roger Kennedy were up at a hearing. Roger was head of the Park Service, and the chairman of the committee, Chairman Murkowski, asked Chief Thomas a question. And before he gave Jack a chance to answer the question, he kind of went on this 4.5-minute rant. And finally, he stopped and he looked at Jack, and Jack says, Senator, I've lost the rabbit. and only Jack could get away with that. And the crowd in the hearing room, which was packed, just bust out laughing, and even Senator Murkowski forgot what the question was. and none of us had to answer it. At any rate, I spent many days with Jack. As you know, his wife Margaret passed away early on and when he became chief. So Jack had some tough years. We had some tough hearings together, and I remember going over the grazing bill in response to what at that time was dubbed by Senator Domenici as Babbitt's War on the West. And so Jack and I are at his apartment. He said, come on over on Saturday. I'll make up some sausage and eggs. And I used the computer. I took notes, and we went through the bill line by line together and prepped for the hearing. And that was sort of the way Jack and I operated, and got to become good friends. And Jack, you know, brought a lot of amazing things to the Forest Service, and both throughout his entire career. But another thing that Jack said, he said to me, he said, you know, Mike, he said, I made one big mistake early on when I was chief. He said, I asked the employees to obey the law and tell the truth. And he said, as soon as those words left my mouth, I tried to shove them back in, but I just couldn't put them back again. At any rate, I just had to say a few words about Jack. But the 90s were salvage rider, moving on from the spotted owl issue, the Forest Service budget issue, the old timber production model that F. Dale talked about was really, those days were over. And the agency was in a sense struggling with where do we go next? You remember the words, a muddled mission. We can go from A to B, but we don't know exactly where B is, all of that. And what I tried to bring to the Forest Service as chief is a return to talking about conservation and why land is important, and water, and the various values as we moved forward, as F. Dale mentioned, the ecosystem management approach, new perspectives, and who's going to want us in 50 years and why. At the same time, a lot of other things were going on. 1,300 EEO cases, and I got to thank Tom Thompson for coming in and helping us out with that. In fact, Tom was just reminding Chief Bosworth and I about that. Tom set up a trip that I was probably the only chief who in this period of, what was it, Tom, a week, went to every region, met at every station, talked to every regional forester, forest supervisor, project leader, and you know, it seems like a blur. And I don't know what we felt like when we got home that Friday night, Tom, but it was probably very, very tired. So there was a lot going on, but I'm one who believes that the American public, while they care about the internal politics, they care more about land and water and watershed health. A lot of you that were in the room when we met in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Chairman Vento was part of the committee that we came up with the natural resources agenda that focused on sustainable forest and grassland management, forest health, recreation, watershed health and restoration, and roads. And of course, because of the changes in the timber program, the money wasn't flowing in, our roads budget had tanked, and of course that led to a lot of other things like roadless, which, you know, we've all spent way too much time thinking about, and of course are in the midst of that whole issue. But the bottom line is people care about land, and I didn't even talk about fire, with which Jack Ward Thomas and I dealt with the sad times of fatalities, and I've got to thank chiefs that followed me for all they did with fire and how the much more catastrophic fires had become after, say, about 2000 and beyond. And speaking of fire, the first time I met Randy Moore, he was supervisor of the Mark Twain, and we did a video together on fire. And I got to tell you, when Randy became chief, I called him and I said, I don't know what you did in California, but when you took that regional forester job in California, you did amazing things, because I got to say that Lynn Sprague and many others here will know that there's hardly a job that's tougher at that time than the regional forester job in California. And Randy just did a superb job there, and my wish to Randy was that he was as effective nationally as anything. But I got to tell you a little bit about the bonds that we've developed as chiefs. Dale Bosworth and I were at John Muma's memorial service, and I said to Dale, I said, you know, we talked about, wouldn't it be fun for the chiefs to get together again and get to know each other a little bit as people? We knew several of us relatively well, but not all. And I said, let's think about that. So I said, well, we could either meet in Missoula, or we could come to Wisconsin, where I grew up on the Chequamegon. And surprisingly, they all said, well, 4 of us have lived in Missoula. We don't want to go to Missoula. We've been there. Let's go to Wisconsin. So we got together in Wisconsin on Moose Lake, where I have a place, in fact, 2 miles from where I grew up. Who would have thought that a kid from you know, the middle of nowhere would end up, you know, with the jobs I've had, and flying in Air Force One and Marine One and Air Force Two was amazing. But what was even more amazing, with 6 of us there, Randy was chief at the time, and he never did commit that he was going to come. And it was about 7 in the morning, and we're probably having breakfast, and I look out the window and I said, there's this tall guy wandering around outside. Who is this? And it was Chief Moore. So thank you, Randy, for, we were just honored that you could make it, and we all got together, and that really led to a lot of the unity that you see with us, and taking on issues and trying to honor the employees of the Forest Service today, and do everything we can to support them and encourage them to stay the course. The country needs you.
Well, first I want to say congratulations, Randy, on your retirement. That's the first thing and the most important thing I'm going to say. You know, when I became chief in April 2001, Randy was the Forest Supervisor in the Mark Twain. And I was all excited to go into the office the first day. And I had a whole bunch of emails that were just coming in. I'm sure they're all going to just tell me what a great job I have, and I was just looking forward to read them. Well, one of the first emails came from some weird address, like Long Stockings or something. So I had no idea who it was from. And all it said was, spineless pawn. And then I thought it was my wife, Karma. But she denied it. So I printed it, and I got a file folder, and I put it in that file folder, and I named that file folder Fan Mail. And that fan mail folder, it filled up faster than any other folder I had. And I doubt anything like that happened to you, Randy. You got all sorts of comments about how wonderful you were. Well, 5 months later was 9/11, you know, when the Twin Towers were attacked in the Pentagon. And that was a very terrible and difficult time for everyone. But I was really, really proud of our incident management teams that went to New York City and to the Pentagon to help out. You know, they were amazing. I visited them in New York City and at the Pentagon. And there isn't enough time for me to tell you about those first days. They were very, very difficult days. Several months later, Randy was named Regional Forester for Region 9. And I have to tell you that that was a brilliant decision on my part. Now, about a year later, we developed what I called the 4 threats to our nation's forests and grasslands. And I can't remember anything over 3 anymore, so I wrote them down. And the 4 threats were the unnatural buildup of fuels and resulting fires, and invasive species like weeds, insects, and pathogens, the loss of open space, ranches and private forests being turned into strip malls and subdivisions, and unmanaged recreation, which for me was primarily ATVs and the damages, all-terrain vehicles, and the damages they were causing. And so I spent a lot of time talking with editorial boards and with university people and colleges and any organization that I could to try to help us address those 4 threats. In 2003, though, you know, Congress passed the Healthy Forests Restoration Act. And that was supposed to deal with, you know, help us deal with the conditions of the forests and, you know, reduce the fuels, get the resilience back into the forests so they're more resilient to pests and to fire. And I think that it was probably the first time that Congress had ever helped us do something to help us get work done on the ground. I mean, sure seemed different to me. You know, it wasn't great. I mean, it didn't go far enough, but it was the first step. First time that somebody had really tried to help us, that Congress really tried to help us get more work done with less money, less time. You know, we also developed a travel management rule to deal with the all-terrain vehicles. And this rule was going to restrict ATVs to designated roads and trails and areas. And, you know, the cross-country travel was damaging streams. It was adding sediment to them, the spreading invasive species and creating new unwanted roads. So Jack Troyer, in this room here somewhere, led a team to develop that rule and work with stakeholders. And he and that team did an amazing, a masterful job. And a lot of people told me that there was no way that we'd be able to pull this off during the Republican administration. Well, those people don't know Jack Troyer, because it got done. Now, 2005 was the centennial year for the Forest Service, and that was kind of an interesting time. And Tom Thompson was the deputy chief, and he took on the job to run all the activities and things celebrating that event. And that was an amazing job. You know, the film The Greatest Good was one of the things, and Dave Stanke is around here somewhere, I think, was one of the people that did that. It just, you know, that was just, got seen all over the country. The Smithsonian Folklife Festival on the Mall in Washington, that was another thing that they pulled off. And I don't think that there's ever been any other federal agency that was featured at the National Mall and the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, the U.S. Forest Service. That was amazing. You know, we also had the Forest Supervisors gathering at the Arbor Day Foundation's farm. We had Centennial Forest Congress. And throughout that year, the fabulous fiddling foresters, and I think their name should be the fabulous fiddling foresters, not just fiddling foresters. Anyway, they played music around the country, and they were, you know, raising awareness of conservation to a lot of people that didn't know that much about it. There were some other activities that during the year, but I just have to say that I'm going to be forever grateful for Tom for his leadership. I mean, that really made the year. And so then I retired in 2007. And I want to say a few things about Randy. Randy was Forest Supervisor when I first met him. I got to know him over the next several months, and I was very impressed with him. And after he was promoted to Regional Forester, for the Eastern region, that's when I really got to know him better, a lot better. Randy's an outstanding leader. He's a good listener. He's smart, and he's fun to be around. But one of his most endearing qualities is he is an Oakland Raiders fan. Yay, yay. Now, he and I visited the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire once, and it was a great visit. They had good people, and we saw they were doing good work. We saw a lot of that good work. But I was preparing to run the Army 10-miler in a couple of weeks, and I wanted to go out and do a little bit of running, and because I needed to get a few miles in. And so I said, Randy, would you go out with me and run? He said, sure, how far are you going to go? And I said, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles is all. He said, I only do 3. And I said, come on, Randy, you can do more than 3. No, I can only do 3. So, okay, well, let's go. So he said, okay, you'd go. So we take off. And I had a GPS watch. And so a little bit, not too long, he says, how far we go? I said, half a mile. And so then we kept going, and he asked me again, no, how far is it now? And I said, it's 2.1. And then he asked again. And I said, oh, we just hit 3. He says, I'm done. And I said, we can go a little further, Randy. Nope, I'm walking back to the hotel. So I don't remember whether I walked back to the hotel, whether I kept running, but I'm pretty sure I walked back to the hotel because that's just a nice guy that I am, you know. But anyway, what I learned is that Randy is a man of his word. Well, after I retired, Randy went on to be regional forester in California, and you couldn't have picked a better person to go be regional forester in California. You know, he was the right person at the right time for that very, very difficult job, and he did it amazingly well. So I just want to make one last comment, not about Randy, but about me. You know, I always felt very fortunate to work for the Forest Service, and it was for a couple of reasons. You know, we get to live near and care for some of the most fabulous country in the United States, but to me, even more importantly, is for 41 years, I got to work with the best of the best people in this country, and they love the Forest Service just as much as I do.
These are not easy acts to follow. Well, I went on to be the 16th chief and went into the Washington office in January, and Lanice Lago applied a fire hose to me to prep me for budget hearings. I didn't think that was a very fair way to start. But I spent quite some time preparing for budget meetings, and I had quite some learning. My career has been in was at the time, Region 10, Region 6, Region 2, and I'd not spent any time in California, and I'd not spent time in Regions 3, 8, 9. I had a lot to learn. I learned that the Forest Service does work differently in different places. Shocking, just shocking. One of the things that I learned was when we do oil and gas leasing in Pennsylvania, it's different than what we did in places I had worked. Well, I was going to travel with Randy, and we were going to travel to the Allegheny National Forest. Yeah, it's a great spot. And we were going to be having dinner with the Forest Supervisor, some of the staff, and with congressional representatives and their staff. We had a schedule. Randy picked me up at the airport. We got on some freeway. I don't know. Randy was driving. I'm sure he knew where we were going. So we're having a discussion. At the same time, Bernie Weingart, who'd done a wonderful job in California, Bernie had announced he was going to retire. We needed a regional forester in California. So Randy's driving, and I'm just blabbing along as we go down the road. And I said, so, Randy, you've done such a fabulous job in Region 9. You have congressional people from how many states? Don't you think one state would be easier to handle? Randy, would you think of going to California? And this look of panic just across his face. And we missed our exit by about 60 miles. We were late for our meeting by the time we got back to the exit. And we might have been traveling a little more quickly than we should have been. There were those flashing lights behind us. And Randy just very comfortably, very calmly talked to the nice person in uniform, and who allowed us to just go on our way. And so Randy's going through this whole emotional of like, oh my God, she's going to send me to California. Through this whole evening where we're talking about NEPA and oil and gas leasing on the Allegheny National Forest. And again, it's really different from anything I had dealt with. And I was really glad that the Forest Supervisor and Randy had such a strong handle on it. Well, Randy needed to talk to Antoinette, and which was advisable. Yeah. And Randy agreed to go to California. Yay. Shortly after that, I was in a SAF meeting in Portland, Oregon, and really looking forward to some of the different programs that were going to happen in the SAF meeting. And all of a sudden, I needed to go to Southern California because the president was going to go see Randy on a fire in Southern California. And Jim Caswell was there too because the BLM was very involved in that fire. And so we go trundling off to Southern California, missed the rest of the SAF meeting, had to borrow uniform pieces, boots, all kinds of things, because I didn't travel to Portland with all of that. And we meet Randy in Southern California. The President of the United States gets out of a helicopter, walks over, shakes hands with us, spent the rest of the time with Randy. But the President of the United States, George W. Bush, also spent time with our crews. And he was just marvelous. He just went over and shook hands with everybody on a 20-person crew and had his picture taken with them all. It was really pretty wonderful. And he said, you must be very proud of the job your people are doing on this fire, because Forest Service crews are the best. Well, yeah. Didn't he, Jim? So there are a number of things going on during that time that Randy was in California. The one that absorbed most of my time was fire. There were challenges to a number of land management plans that were kind of exciting. There were a lot of forest health issues, forest health questions. There still are. There's a lot of great work going on in California because Randy hired fabulous people to continue working those issues and to get some successes on the ground. And thank you for doing that. So Randy, I wish you the very best in retirement, and I look forward to seeing you sometime in Oregon.
Well, thank you, Gail. I had the honor to be your chief from 2009 to 2017, and it was really Bosworth that started this number business, but 17th, whatever that's worth. And I really appreciate especially Mike and Dale pointing out some people that helped them. But I kept waiting to hear my name, the guy that staffed so many of their hearings and prepped them so that when they went up on the Hill, they actually did a really good job to represent the Forest Service. So you're welcome. I, too, was one of several that did everything they could to avoid going back to Washington for the second time. And even though it's an incredible honor to be a chief, it's tough. And I was fortunate that I was living in Missoula at the time as the regional forester here. And luckily, I had a chief down the road that had a home, and then a retired chief down the road that had a home, and then also had Jack Ward Thomas down the river. So I got a lot of free advice. And I think Bosworth was at the house, and I think it had been announced, or it was going to be, and Dale asked my daughter, who was a freshman in high school, and he said, Mackenzie, what do you think about your dad being chief? And she goes, well, just like you guys, it's just another job. And Dale goes, well, it's a little more than that. And it was, but I really appreciated the insight that I gained from you folks. And then I was very fortunate that I came into the Washington office, and I already had a great associate chief, Hank Cashton, there to guide me. And then Mary Wagner came in as when Hank retired. Tim DeCoster somehow hung in there to be chief of staff for me. And then I also had, I needed an extra associate chief, and that was Carla Hawley, to make sure that everything worked well. And I could go around this room and every single table thank most of you that helped me throughout my career. But it was an interesting time for us in the Forest Service, and fire was the big deal, as it had been started a few years before that. But throughout that, my whole time, it was one catastrophic fire after another. And then we had this other deal, the constrained budget, that President Obama had worked out a deal with Congress that the federal budget wouldn't go up until we got through the recession and inflation was actually we got people back to work, et cetera. So for the next 6-7 years, every year we had to take another $150 million out of all of the other programs and put it into fire suppression because our budget could not go up. And luckily we had some great people that were already in the Washington office, and Lanice Lago had a little too much, so she wanted to go out, I think, to Region 6 and hang out for a little while, but that didn't last very long before, Lanice, we need you to come back. And she came back as our deputy chief to help us really deal with that. But it was really challenging times, and we spent a lot of time trying to help Congress understand we're doing everything we can to be very effective with fire suppression, but things have changed. And then I started talking about climate change. And luckily we had some great scientists that had already been studying this. And I asked them, I said, how can we talk about this in a way that'll help people understand it and just not get defensive? And they just came out with this great little deal, and they said, you know, Chief, fire seasons today are 63 days longer than they were like in the early 90s. And I go, 63 days? And I go, well, I can talk about 60. And they go, no, 63 days. And so we started really talking about that, how we had these hotter, longer, drier fire seasons, and the consequences of that. And no matter what you're doing out there, it's going to take more resources. And there was times that I thought regional foresters were going out of their way to almost compete to see who could spend the most fire suppression funds. And there was especially one region, I think it was Region 5, and of course had some help out there to spend the money. But I swear sometimes it was a competition between the regional foresters. But luckily, I'd worked in Region 5 before and had dealt with the fire there, and so Randy and his team are doing a great job, but it was just really tough times. The other thing that was going on at this time was this concept of collaboration. And luckily, when I'd worked in this region, who I can point to several folks in this audience that were kind of the folks that really helped me to understand the power of true collaboration. And it's just not bringing folks together, but it's the concept of bringing diverse interests together, and you sit down and you listen, and you let those folks come up with solutions. And the Forest Service had to be okay. We still were making the decisions, but these groups were actually coming up with very good decisions that we could then embrace, sign off on, and move forward. And throughout my time, we just built on that. And it was so gratifying that many, if not most, of the legislation that occurred during my time that dealt with the Forest Service required collaboration. And it was really a true honor that folks recognize that. And Region 5 was out there on the lead on that. They did a great job. We had another big fire on the El Dorado, I think King's Fire maybe, at that time. And the industry was just yelling, we need more wood, we need more wood, even though there was no housing market, they needed more wood. And the lobbyists said, oh, there's 1 billion board feet of salvage there, you know, if we could get at it. And of course, there's always the urgency. And so I asked Randy, I said, you know, hey, we got to do everything we can. So through his leadership and the folks on the El Dorado, and I'm sure other folks in the regional office, they set a record of getting an EIS through in less than a year to be able to put the sale up. And the other thing, the way we were able to do that is because we had to go to CEQ and ask for alternative arrangements to be able to expedite the public comment processes for an EIS. So we're talking about a Democratic administration, talking about a salvage sale, and CEQ signs off on it. And I still have that letter. And that was the start of many of those opportunities we had with CEQ. Now, the only downside of this is, of course, Forest put the sales up, put them out, and of course, they sold very little of it because there was no market. But they were doing everything they could. And then the work that the region was doing with biomass, doing everything they could to find a way to be able to get more of the wood, the biomass off our national forests that were really contributing to the threat to our communities. And were doing great work that really, example after example of how the fields treatments were making a difference as these fires would burn into our communities. And it was just incredible leadership. And even though a lot of the stuff we were doing in the Forest Service is always controversial, from my view, we had tremendous support. And yeah, there was some tough hearings that we had on the Hill, but for the most part, there was bipartisan support because folks recognized that what the Forest Service was doing everything they can to be able to work through this with limited resources. And what they were hearing from the communities and from the counties and from the states is how well these folks were working across the board with other people, with our local communities, with the interest groups. Another great example of the collaboration was towards the end of President Obama's second term. you know, presidents like to put their name on things. And it was monument time. And so we had a few monuments in a few places, but being in Region 5, one's not enough. So we had to do 3. And a couple of them were really easy. The snow to sea was a pretty easy one because that was just included a wilderness off of the forest, so that was a slam dunk. And then we did the Berryessa Snow Mountain, and that was just fantastic. And we had a lot of members from Congress come out there and tell us what a great job we were doing. And then there was this effort down on the Angeles to create a monument that took in, to start with, the majority of the Angeles. The only problem was it was coming from the Park Service. And the Park Service, bless their little hearts, had lined up all the politicians, had lined up the White House, that they wanted a monument. They wanted a big piece of country there in Southern California because, you know, they recognized the benefits of having some presence down there in a big way, and they went at it. And they're very good at it. And nothing against the Park Service, but the things that go on in a national forest is a little different than a park. And through Randy's work and his staff, they turned that around. And the only way we ever pulled it off is that the Park Service was making a great claim that, hey, if it's our monument, we bring a lot of money, we can fix the trails and the roads and everything, and your Forest Service, you guys don't have a budget, which is true. But through one of the great partnerships that have been going on, Randy's team was able to work with a great partner, and they raised a lot of extra money that we could put into the pot to be able to save that. And if it wasn't for that, that big part of the Angeles, San Gabriel monument wouldn't be national forest. But it's just one of those things that went on that a lot of folks didn't hear about. But the benefit of taking the time, working with people, building these collaborative efforts were just fantastic. The other thing that was so great about Randy, and you know, he had this way of doing things, and I'd watch him because I wanted to learn because everything he was doing was so easy, and he had this fantastic way to be able to get people to follow him. And so I would watch that, and you know, and he just had his way to work with people and connect with people in a way that they wanted to be like him, they wanted to follow him. And I can't thank Randy and really everyone that's on this stage and most of the folks here in the audience that worked with me about the work that we did to build on the legacy of diversity and inclusion in the Forest Service. And this legacy started with F. Dale Robertson. And all of the folks up here worked on it and worked hard on it. But we were still at a point which I became quite frustrated that, yeah, we wanted to hire, you know, the right people, the best people, and our numbers were okay, but I was struggling about folks were just focused on numbers. And I go, well, it's important to track things, but diversity, this concept of inclusion, it's so important. It's just common sense. And you have to get folks to understand that we need to be doing this, not to have different people in the organization, but because it's the right thing to do. This concept of diversity, valuing diversity of thought, and to be able to have an organization that, when America looked at the Forest Service, they saw themselves to create a place where everyone is welcome. And it makes us all better. And Randy and the whole team were just great supporters and leaders of this. And you know, Randy led the way there in Region 5, and I really appreciated the stance he took, the support that he always gave me, because we had some tough discussions at the leadership team area, and then also when I'd come out to the forest. And one last minute here, and I'll pass this on. But Randy, as everyone's been talking, he's did a pretty good job as an RF. You know, I think that's pretty clear. But he did have his moments. And I was out with him once, and he always wanted to go out and see what was going on in the forest. And our law enforcement folks wanted us to go out and look at cleanup on a marijuana garden. And there was a lot of marijuana gardens in Region 5. And so Randy and I went out there, and they flew us in there, and we're down there, and we're talking to the folks, and I'm overlooking at the damage that's gone on in the stream, and looking at the trash and stuff. And I look over and I see Randy, and he's over there with another one of our law enforcement officers, and he's picking up the plants to see how tall they are and putting them in the pile because they were going to fly them out. We couldn't dare burn them. It was fire season. And, and we had a good visit, and I think our law enforcement folks appreciated that. And so we left and flew back to, I think, Sacramento. And then Randy goes, well, what else do you want to do? We got a couple hours. And I said, well, let's go to a fire camp. I always wanted to touch base with our fire folks. And so we took off, drove in there. And one of the benefits of being chief is wherever you would go, law enforcement would be there because they always wanted to be the first ones on the case if something happened so they could just tell people about it. And so we get out of the car, and we're walking into camp, and the law enforcement officer, Forest Service guy, is there to greet us, and he has his dog, his canine unit. And I walk up and shake hands, and and thank him and that stuff. And this dog is just being really friendly with Randy. And Randy's looking down there, and he's trying to pet it, and I'm looking over, and to be fair, I could have been a little quicker to kind of explain what was going on, but I have to admit it was too much fun. And then the dog lays down and goes on point. And our law enforcement officer's looking at me, and he goes, what? And then I finally had to say, well, we were out at the garden, and Randy was helping him clean up. And he goes, oh, well, I can, you'd expect that from a regional forester, and I could see that, the chief didn't get his hands dirty, but. So with that, that's just one of many things. And I too, Randy, want to thank you for your career, and personally for the support you always gave me. And it was one of my proudest moments when you got to be chief, so thank you.
Good evening. It is tough to follow here. Well, I met Randy before I even came to the Forest Service. Many of you probably know I had a career in state forestry before my last dozen years at the Forest Service, and I was state forester of Washington State and Arizona, and so we had a Western Forestry Leadership Coalition, and I knew right then and there that Randy was one to watch. He had a knack for, I call it his leadership swagger, for people that really could follow. I mean, it was natural to listen to what Randy had to say, because what he said weren't just words, there was something behind them. He always listened. And I'll fast forward. Well, let me say this. I tell people all the time that I've helped implement the mission of the Forest Service for my entire 42-year career to sustain the nation's forest and grasslands. It was just 30 of them in state organizations, and then the last 12 through the Forest Service. So I've got to view the lens of both sides of how we sustain our nation's forests. And of course, being in the West, both of my states, I did lots of issues around neighborhoods or being a neighbor of the many national forests in those states. But I'm going to tell a little story on Tom and Randy, and Corbin Newman is involved here as well. Tom, he didn't say it, but under his tenure, the National Wildland Fire Cohesive Strategy was adopted, and I was still on the state forester side working on that. So Tom and I worked closely together, and next thing you know, there's some encouragement for me to apply for the Deputy Director of Fire and Aviation. So went through that whole process, and Tom Tidwell and Tom Harbor had just offered me the position, and I had just accepted. And Randy and Corbin and I were at a state foresters meeting, and they both ganged up on me. And they both had deputy regional forester positions, and they said, why don't you apply for this? And I said, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm busy. I mean, it was the time, you know, where I couldn't tell them. The announcement hadn't come out yet. So anyway, I don't know if this Tom ever knew that story, that they were trying to get me to come over to the region. Instead, I went into the Washington office. And we are just talking about eras of our times as chief. We can't do what we did in Lead Forward without all of you and the many of the others that aren't here. And it always feels funny talking about, you know, being the chief. It's a representative of the whole of the Forest Service. I became chief in less than 24 hours. I was the surprise tag, you're it, chief. I had been deputy chief, and many of us know the previous chief stepped down suddenly, and so I took over in an era of extreme scrutiny and crisis for the agency. We were under intense criticism, quite frankly, for a culture of sexual harassment. And while our workforce really had become more diverse, there was still too many people that felt pressure to stay silent, that, you know, you sort of had to go along to get along. And it was an evolution of what all these predecessors before me had led through, but we really had to come to grips that if we were going to truly serve all Americans, we had to change. So we worked really, really, really hard on becoming a values-based, purpose-driven, relationship-focused organization. And there's so many in this room that were a part of that. Lanice Lago was my associate chief. She was the rock, the engineer, the innovator. Claire Levindahl is here. She was a major piece of that work. And it was about all of us really regrouping so that every employee felt valued, felt safe, felt welcome, and like they had a true purpose to this organization. And Region 5 was a real leader in leading out. And we had to practice this. It wasn't anything that necessarily we could do in a moment's notice, but we were tested. We were tested many times. I think we all had our tests. First test was a historic 35-day government shutdown. That doesn't sound like anything right now, but when you have your GS3s and 4s, your law enforcement and your firefighters out there without a paycheck, they still have to do childcare, they have to put gas in the car, and they're not getting paid for 3, 4 paychecks, that's significant. We had to really lean into our values about how we cared for each other. Historic fire seasons, yes, the Labor Day fires and many others, significant hurricanes, strained budgets, and yes, we were the era of the pandemic. And as we're facing field and fire season, and it took all of our collective energy and brains, and I can remember Randy being rock solid in these, you know, many multiple evening calls on how we were going to get our workforce ready for this. We still had to respond to fires. We had 300% increase in use on our national forests because folks needed a place to go, and there were so many challenges to work through. And Randy stood up and became a real advocate for both service to the public and to the safety of our employees. And you know, that really tested us, though. It caused us to innovate, and we use science, the incredible science in this organization, risk science and so much more, on how we can deliver our services differently. I was able to get out to a fire camp where everything was electronic. You know how all the big movements that we move forward in a time of crisis, you make something good out of it. And there was many things that came out good out of many of those challenges. As Tom described, we were sinking because more of our budgets were going to wildfire. And it was really more under Tom's tenure, but I got to do the celebration under my time where over 300 groups came together in a major coalition, and it took almost 10 years. Congress passed the fire funding fix. And that did a reset for us on, at least we didn't continue to eat into our natural resource budgets. We all know that we had significant backlog of recreation and roads. We also got the bipartisan Great America Outdoors Act, and so many other things, conservation financing, mass timber, and new markets for our needed improvement in our forests. All of this was done with a shared vision. I mean, many days felt like a crisis, but we always had a shared vision and we had each other's back. And to just try to put a few stories about Randy, I need to close up here. He was, in my tenure, he was the dean of the regional foresters, okay? He was the most senior regional forester, and it's really, really important that you get that input as chief. You needed to know that was operational realities, and Randy would be straight, he'd be diplomatic, but he'd always let me know what was going on, and he'd take a temperature from the rest of his peers. He led out with innovation and doing business differently, centralizing budget across the region, conservation financing, and many other things. And Randy would make noises like, well, you know, he's been out here long enough, maybe it's time to, you know, retire. And I would say, we had many drives. It's Randy and drives, right? I said, well, Randy, let's think about this a minute. Well, we don't really have your predecessor prepared yet. There were several options we had. And give me one more year, okay? Okay, one more year. And year 2, same drive, different place. Randy, how about one more year? I think he had to go back and talk to Antoinette on that one, and then, okay, one more year. And then I called him up this time. I said, Randy, guess what? I need to go home and be with family. I'm retiring. Tag, you're it. It didn't quite work exactly that way, but good plans played out. Randy's always steady, he's thoughtful, he's caring, he always has integrity, and he's just the best good-hearted person that I will admire forever. It's all yours, Randy.
So, good afternoon, and I am paying attention that you were paying attention to the cake. Before I get started, I really want to recognize my wife. As a Forest Service employee, and as for all of you all out there too, it's the spouse that keeps everything going. And while a lot of us get a lot of credit for doing things within the agency, we would not be able to do that if we didn't have that solid backbone to take care of things at home. And it reminds me, as I was getting started, looking at the different leadership positions, I would ask a lot of, at the time, the old timers, which I'm one now, that as you look back on your career, what is it that you regret? And there's a lot of different answers depending on who you talk to, but one of the things that was really common is that they regret not spending more time with their kids. And I have kept that with me my entire career. And I remember as I was getting started, I started out as a GS1. They don't even make those anymore. But the point is, I started at the lowest level possible in the organization. And I have always kept a GS1 attitude no matter where I've gone. Because I remember when I worked as a co-op student, and we were still in college, and they had us doing something different every week, every 3 weeks. Timber stand improvement, cleaning toilets, doing other recreational kinds of things. And I remember I didn't know anything about the Forest Service except the district ranger. And the district ranger was just revered. And so in my mind, I thought the district rangers was God. And so when you talk about a forest supervisor or a regional forester or a chief, I didn't know what that was, because if the ranger was God, then who else would be over them? And that was my attitude, but that was my orientation to the Forest Service, because everything revolved around the ranger. And so I've tried to keep that in mind as I've gone. I started looking at, kind of reflecting on tonight, and I said, well, what has my journey been like getting to the chief job? And I started out looking at 7 steps to becoming the chief. For me, not you, me. And I remember when we first started, I was only at Pike St. Isabel, and I was a soil scientist there, and I remember my boss at the time, I had moved down from North Dakota, and I was new to the Forest Service, and he asked me, he said, do you know how to camp? And so I thought, if you're going to be a Forest Service employee, you had to say yes. And so I said, yes, of course. And I had a work study student with me. He lived in Colorado. We were in Colorado. And I had a plan. And so my boss at the time, he knew I didn't know nothing about camping. But he had to go to a training. And he gave me all of my equipment, the tent, the stove, and a map to find the location to go out and do surveying and mapping. And we got out to the site. We worked all day. And when evening came, I asked my work study, why aren't you going to set up the tent? And he says, well, no, I don't know how. And so, naive. So I said, well, what do you mean you don't know how? You're from Colorado. And he said, well, what do you mean you don't know? You work for the Forest Service. And that was my orientation to the Forest Service that first year that I met. And interestingly enough, my job in Colorado on the Pike St. Isabel, we went out in the field and we camped out 4 days. We left on Monday, came back Thursday night. And when I came back into the town, I wanted civilization of a different kind. And that's when I met my wife. And we have been together ever since, about 44 years now. So, and she happened to be visited from California at the time, her family in Colorado, but we connected. We had a good week. And so, thank you. The other thing, though, is in the Forest Service, the one thing that I've always appreciated is that you get to do a lot of different things. And you get used to doing many different things. And even though I was a soil scientist at the time, they had this thing called collateral duty, EEO. And so the Forest Supervisor at the time gave me that. And I accepted it, not knowing what it was. But I learned a lot. That was one of the pillars, one of these 7 foundations that I'm talking about, is the other side of the agency. And I remember going through, and at the time, Max Peterson was the chief. Then F. Dell came in to be the chief. And they wanted to talk about diversity. And at the time, the diversity person talked about diversity. I didn't know that. I thought that they saw something special in me that I could talk about this issue. But I was it, what I found out. And so when I would do the EEO duties, I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't dress like I'm going to the field. Maybe I should put on some different clothes. And so I went. My wife was gone somewhere. And I went and I bought a different set of clothes. I bought a blue pair of pants, a black pair of pants, and a brown pair of pants. I bought a black pair of shoes, and I bought a brown pair of shoes. And I laid them out on the bed because I was so proud of myself. My wife came home, and I said, "What do you think?" She said, "You bought all the same thing." And I said, "What do you mean the same thing?" "Black, blue, brown, black and brown shoes." She said, "But they're all the same kind." And for me, that was my first lesson talking about diversity. You can be different colors, but you can also be the same in many people's eyes. So remember, these are things that we collect. And so we, here's another thing that you collect in your travels, and you put that in your pocket, and you continue to move through the organization. And here again, I remember leaving there, and Jack Weisling, who was the Forest Supervisor at the time, and I had gotten comfortable in Pueblo. And Jack Weisling was going to upgrade the hydrologist position and the soil scientist position, but he didn't upgrade it as long as I was there. And he was the one that was really firm with me, because we're going to upgrade the hydrologist position. And so I said, "Well, why wouldn't you upgrade the position?" I mean, he had told me that I was like a son to him. This is how you treat your kids, is what I was thinking, because he had become a mentor to me. And yet he would not promote me. And he said if he did that, I would never leave. And he thought I had too much potential to stay put. So I applied for a job because I was mad in Washington, D.C. And I told my wife, she had just, she had grew up in California. She was back in Colorado. We had just gotten married. She was getting used to her family and didn't want to leave. And I said, "Look, I'm going to apply for this job, but I won't get it." I said, "But I'm going to show Jack that, there's opportunities elsewhere." So anyway, long story short, I got the job. I came back and I told my wife, and she immediately started crying, because she was just getting to know her family there, and I'm taking her away. And that was another step, and why I so appreciate spouses that support that employee. The other piece, though, when I got into the Washington office, our first trip got to D.C., there were no blocks. There was triangles. And if you're used to blocks, you will be forever lost. And we were lost in D.C. when we got there. And we won't tell you about the pimp that we saw and all of that stuff, but for us, that was so foreign. But we kept moving forward. And so we got into the Washington office, and Jim Overbay was the deputy chief for NFS. And Jim Overbay at the time thought that it would be a good idea that if I would be like an ad hoc member to the Washington office leadership team. And I said, okay, and everybody treated me good on the surface. And I remember feeling comfortable with that group of distinguished leaders. I'm not going to name any names because I don't want you guessing. But I got to the point where I thought I could share what my opinion was. And this one senior leader shot me down. And I was feeling terrible. So when they had the break, Jim Overbay came outside. He said, "I bet you feel like you've been run over." I said, Yep. He said, "Well, shake the dust off and get back in there." And that was when I knew I had support. Because even if I didn't feel I had something of value to say, I knew that I had support from the leader to go back in there and try it again. And so I was forever thankful. That was another lesson for me as I was going through this. And so then I went to North Carolina as the acting deputy forest supervisor. And at the time, actings lasted for years or so. And that was my first lesson to the value of an executive assistant. And her name was Sherry Fisher there in North Carolina. And I got to see what that should look like. And so I kept that in my head because that's important. And what I learned is that that executive assistant, or that special assistant, have the pulse of the forest, the pulse of they have the pulse of what's going on. Because they can see things that you don't see, and people tell them things that they wouldn't tell you. And so that is important. And so it became really important for me, how do you use that person that has so much value that may not be used to their extent? And so I've always valued my executive assistant, and that's why I have always used them perhaps a little bit differently. So I left there, came to the Mark Twain, and this is where I first met Mike Dumbeck. And Mike, you know, we didn't tell you because you was the chief, and I was just a forest supervisor. But the thing about that time, Mike picked up a torch. We were doing a prescribed burn, and Mike started walking through the woods dropping fire. And we were all so nervous, but no one wanted to tell the chief to don't do that. and so we didn't tell him, but we followed him. And so that was our first introduction to Mike on that piece there. And as all of them have told their story, there's also another side. You know, the truth depends on who's telling that story. And I remember when Dale was still he was the chief, and, you know, I had moved into the Region Forest position in Region 9. And I'd been there for a little while, and I came in and I told Dale, I said, Dale, I can do forest plan revisions in 2 years. And Schwamick and Nicolay at the time, they was on their 5th or 6th year, and they still hadn't completed it. And I could see the look in his eyes. He supported me, but he did not believe me. And so I said, okay, I got it. And sure enough, long story short again, we did it in 2 years. We did 12 plans in 2 years. And so we demonstrated that plans could be done if you paid attention to it. And so that was, to give credit to Dale, he gave me the license, permission, and the support to make some substantial changes to that. And the story that Gail has, you know, we all have different versions of that story about when I picked her up and she wanted me to go to Region 5. My version of that was that Gail, we were driving, and Gail just asked the question, what do you think about Region 5? Well, I said, well, not much. But it was an innocent not much because I hadn't thought much about it. And so Gail said, you know how Gail, she said, well, okay. And we drove a little bit long, and she said, well, if you had to think about Region 5, what would you think? I said, well, not much. But I began to get nervous. And I have lied on my wife many times, and this was another time, where I thought I could buy some time. Because that next question Gail had was, well, I want you to think about Region 5. And I said, well, I need to talk to my wife, because I think she's tired of moving. And I did. But I was so nervous that I began to speed. And the state patrol pulled us over, and Gail begged him to give me a ticket. She didn't tell you that. And she was looking for leverage. And you all, if anyone knows Gail, you know that that's more of a true version of that story. So anyway, I went home and I did talk to my wife. I said, you know, what do you think about California? You know, so we went through that scenario. Long story short, I went and looked online, and I got thrilled with Region 5. And I remember coming back the next week, and I called Gail back up, and I said, well, she told me first. She said, you know, don't worry about going to Region 5. She said, because if you go to Region 5, you need to want to go there. She said, because it's too important to send someone there that don't want to be there. But by that time, I was convinced I wanted to go. So the tables had turned. I was trying to convince her then, you know, no, I want to go. And so I, sure enough, I went there. And, you know, the things that I found out about Region 5, I didn't see anything different there than I saw in any other region. It's just that Region 5 had this reputation that was undeserved. And when they were coming out of a consent decree. And when I read through all of the language in that consent decree, the same thing was happening to every region I had been to. It's just that in Region 5, they prefer to sue and then talk. In other regions, they will talk and then sue. But by that time, Region 5 was just inundated. And what I found out is that you had some wonderful employees in that region. And I was so fortunate to be able to go there as regional forester because I fell in love with it. And I went there and I told Antoinette, because I did a little homework, I said, well, you know, don't worry about it. We'll be here 2 or 3 years, because that's what every regional forester was there for, 2 or 3 years. And I ended up being there for 14 years. And I was there for 14 years because I loved it. I loved the issues. And I also had an opportunity to tell a different story about the Forest Service. You see, because California talked about it being the 5th largest economy in the world at the time. And when you have the 5th largest economy in the world, how could the Forest Service be important to that kind of an economy? And so we talked about telling our story, the Forest Service story in Region 5 in California. And here's what it looked like, just to share. We looked at timber, which was our DNA. And when I looked at the value to timber to California's economy, it was only about $500 to $600 million at the time. Now, you can argue and say, well, we should have been cutting more, but let's just start with where we were. It's about $500 to $600 million. Then I looked at the amount of electricity that was generated off national forests. And it was enough to supply 30 million homes electricity for a year. And then I looked at recreation, the value of recreation to that economy. And recreation was valued at $2 billion. And then we took a look at water. And we looked at the agriculture industry in California. And what drives that industry is water. $9 billion worth of water came off national forests to supply that agricultural industry there in California, which was valued at about $47 billion at the time. We took that same amount of water, applied simple math to it, and we looked at the Los Angeles water rates. That same amount of water, same water, but it's cheap for agriculture. But when you use it for drinking purposes, all of a sudden, that was $323 billion worth of water. And so when we talked about the value of the forest to that economy, it was pretty significant. And you see, the issue is that we have not known how to tell our story about the value that we provide to this economy in America. And so when I became chief, that's one of the things that I wanted to bring with me. What is the value of public lands to America? We have to tell that story. There's a lot of discussions going on now about selling off public lands. And we need to keep our public lands public. But in order to do that, people need to know the value of these public lands to the American public. And so we have to be able to tell that story. And the other thing we have to do, you know, we don't want to get into a debate about how much timber we should be cutting and whether it should be saw logs or whether it be small diameter. We have to look into the future, because here's the problem that I fear, that we are going to talk about the next 100 years the same way we talked about the last 100 years. We cannot do that, because if you look at the difference between when Mike Dumbek was chief to when I'm chief, there's different issues that have become important to the American people. And we have to talk about it differently if it's going to resonate with people. So in addition to talking about saw logs, not instead of, but in addition to talking about saw logs, why don't we talk about wood innovations? Why don't we talk about nanocellulose material, cross-laminated timber, biomass, biofuel, Why don't we talk about those things? Because this is where we need to be going. What's the value of carbon? And as we talk about carbon sequestration, what role does forest play? What role should it play? What role should wetlands play? What role should rangelands play? These are the issues of the future. And how do we talk about that? I was reminded of that through our international programs when I traveled in other countries across the world, the same as the other chiefs on the table. They're talking about these issues, these emerging issues, and they're looking at the U.S. and the Forest Service within the U.S. to have a leader's role in that. And I was asked a number of times, what are you doing with carbon sequestration? Well, a lot of people are developing a standard for how you calculate carbon based on their interests. The U.S. needs to have a standard way of calculating carbon. Our scientists are working with a group of people now to talk about a standard method or a standard platform for calculating carbon. When we looked at California, looking at a cap and trade system, Forest Service employees and scientists helped write the forestry sector of that cap and trade. And as California moved into that cap and trade system, the Forest Service gained about $33 million in the last 2 years to do work on Forest Service managed lands. And I say that because we have to stop looking back as though that's the answer to the future. And that would be what I would want to leave with this group, is that we have to look forward. I think the work that the Forest Service does, the employees that the Forest Service employ are second to none. And we have some outstanding people within this agency. And as I look here, I'm always humbled by the pillars of this agency. And you all in this room are pillars and have been pillars of this agency. And this agency is revered throughout the world. And it's because of you and what you have done, what you have meant, and because you have cared so much about natural resource management in this country. And I just want to say thank you, because you have set a tone. It's one that I've certainly adopted throughout my career from everyone on this stage here. And I would say that as we continue to move forward, let's not get caught up on the little things. Let's always keep our eyes forward on the big picture. We shouldn't worry about the small changes that need to be made, because there needs to be changes made. What is that bigger picture? So I just wanted to leave it there. I didn't want to get overly serious on that, but it's something that I've had a passion about for a long time, and that's looking forward, but having an appreciation when we look backwards. So I just want to say again, thank you all. I think everyone on this stage here I've had a chance to work with individually, and everyone has meant so much to my career. And I just want to say, starting with you, Vicky, since you're the most recent, thank you for bringing that perspective from outside in, and then just running with it. Tom, I was telling you earlier, the things that there's a number of things that you have left with me, but it's when you talked about diversity, and when you had made the statement and you made it with conviction, that we are doing this as an agency, and if you don't like it, you might want to look for a different job. That set a tone in the agency. It made a lot of people mad, but it set a right tone in the agency, and I just want to say thank you for that. Gail, you and I, we was reading the Forest together, so was Tom and I, so we all were, it seems like, huh? And I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to go to Region 5. I mean that. I think Region 5 is just forever in my blood. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to go there. And Tom, thank you for letting me stay there. And Dale, you're another one that, we've had a lot of nice sessions, in your room. And, your choice of beverage is sometimes questionable. But it's those moments where we bond and we connect. And I got a chance to see where you were and why you were there. And I just want to say thank you. And Mike, the same thing for you in terms of when you came out on the Mark Twain and just your perspective of pushing those issues. All of those things have been steps in my journey into the chief's office, and I just want to say thank you all for that. And F. Dale, I didn't see you there. You got small all of a sudden to be such a big man. I want to say you were the first one. You know, I remember when the Chiefs was on the stage earlier in my career, and you made the statement that you did not have the support of a lot of your senior leaders when you wanted to move into the diversity area. And as a young person of color at the time, I thought to hear a leader of an agency take that position, but with humility, because you didn't feel like you had all the support that you needed from your staff. That was a turning point for me as a leader. And I just want to say thank you for being true to who you are and your convictions for standing up in that. And then lastly, I would say that, you know, we in the Forest Service with Secretary Vilsack, I'm closing, so we're getting to the end here. This is my last statement. But I remember with Secretary Vilsack, and he called us over. And he wanted to talk about what we were going to do because we were going to be getting money, Bill and Ira, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act monies. And the Forest Service got $10 billion of those monies. And we needed to do something with it. And so we were asked to develop a 10-year plan. And so we developed a 10-year plan. It's known as the Wildfire Crisis Strategy. And we had 10 years to spend that money. Well, the election was coming around. We probably had to speed it up. And so what we did was that, and it was at Secretary Vilsack's request, is that he said, you know, Chief, he says, we either got too much land or not enough money. I said, we don't have enough money, Mr. Secretary. And he said, well, no. He says, how much would you say that we're doing based compared to what we're being asked? And so we sent this around to all the regional foresters and station directors, and you all know us. You know, when you ask a question like that, we don't always tell the complete truth when we respond back, because here's what came back. And they were telling the truth, so it was the real truth, but we get appropriated about $6 billion. When we looked at what we were being asked to do in the budget that we would need, it was about $33 billion. So we were doing somewhere around 19%. We were funded 19% of what we were being asked to do. And all of you probably know that, you know, because people retire, you did their job and yours. You know, it just went cycle, you know. And so that was the first revealing piece, is that we were underfunded. And we were being asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And it bared out to be truthful when we looked at what we're being asked to do versus what we're being funded. And so took that over to the secretary. So he said, $33 billion. And I said, well, that's the answer to your question. And so he said, what if we just doubled what you had, from $6 billion to $12 billion? I said, okay, we'll do about 40% of what we're being asked to do. But we needed to be grateful if we could get another $6 billion. That would be great. And so the Secretary of Vilsack was making a move to do that with OPM. And we ran out of time. But here's what happened. We developed a plan because we couldn't in good conscience ask the workforce to do $10 billion more worth of work when we were clearly being underfunded. And so we hired 5,000 additional employees in the agency. And you know us, once we get going, we are very successful. We actually hired about 5,400 people. You know, we didn't have a governor in there. You know, it didn't just stop, you know, so 5,400 people. And so when you talk about, well, the Forest Service was behind, it was never $700 million, what was mentioned. It was about $500 million. But here's the thing. Our plan, we had 10 years to spend that money, more like 8 years to spend that money. on the average, we lost about 2,000 employees a year through attrition. So we know that at worst, we could reach that 5,000 employees over 2.5, 3 years. And that's what we were looking at doing. But we needed to hire a lot of people to do that additional work that we were being asked to do. And so that's why we hired the additional 5,000 people. Now, we had also needed to look at diversity. And so a part of what we did was try and move into areas that we have not been commonly moved into. And so of that 5,300 people, we had a lot of diversity, gender and ethnicity. And believe it or not, we went from an 18% diversity up to about 27, 28% diversity. And that was a record by far. And we moved the gender from about 34 to about 43. Now, what's interesting is that now the 5,000 people that have left or lost their jobs represent the diversity and inclusion that we had reached through that effort. And I say this, I want to say that diversity and inclusion matters. Because a lot of the young people, a lot of our young people had the skill set to move us into this direction that I mentioned earlier. Carbon sequestration, looking at developing a carbon standard, looking at our research and our science, looking at wood innovations. That was represented in that 5,300 employees that we hired. And that's what is being jeopardized with this latest move. And so I would say that when you can, where you can, get involved. You matter. And I just want you to know that. Now, we stayed way over. That's so consistent with Forest Service ways. And so we apologize to you. But I would like to ask you, as you would join Antoinette and me to have cake with us to our right. I don't think we have ice cream too, but we do have cake. So on behalf of all of the chiefs here, we want to just say thank you for being here. You know, these are really special events, and so we want to just say thank you.
And one round of applause for Chief Moore.